Dear learners, welcome to the MOOC course on environmental sociology. Today we'll be discussing environmental democracy and climate change. Our learning objectives will be the following. In the first part, we look at why the question of environmental justice and democracy is an important one when it comes to climate change. In the second part, we'll try to learn about the history of global climate change negotiations. And in the third part, we'll take up the question of differentiated vulnerabilities to climate change and what are the factors which contribute to this differentiation. So let us begin with the first part. Why is the question of justice or democracy an important question for climate change? Now, as you are well aware, climate change or anthropogenic global warming since the beginning of the industrial period caused by emissions of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere because of human activities is a global phenomenon. So it affects all societies, all countries across the world. But, and this is the first point that needs to be remembered, it was only a handful of countries, the countries that we today call developed countries, which have contributed the lion's share to total cumulative emissions of greenhouse gases till now. But the effects of climate change, the impacts of climate change are felt the world over. It is felt by all countries. The second point to remember is that it is particularly those countries which have contributed less or the least to global cumulative emissions till now, which also bear the biggest brunt of global climate change. Why is that? The reasons are simple. Firstly, purely because of physical reasons, a large number of countries, developing countries, are particularly vulnerable to climate change impacts. For instance, small island states in the Pacific Ocean, in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Indian Ocean are particularly at risk of submergence of large parts of their country because of rising sea levels, which are a consequence of climate change. Therefore, for a large number of developing countries, climate change poses a particularly severe threat to their very existence as nations. Secondly, a large number of developing countries are dependent predominantly on primary sector activities like agriculture, forestry, fishing, etc. Now, activities like agriculture are more directly dependent on natural resources than, for instance, industrial activities. And therefore, developing countries which are dependent on primary activities are naturally also more vulnerable to climate change. And thirdly, developing countries being poor countries, their ability to grapple with climate change, to respond to climate change is also more limited. So that is overall the second point of why developing countries are more vulnerable very often to the impacts of climate change. The third point to remember about the relationship between justice and climate change is that it is precisely because developed countries have emitted more in the past that they are today in a better position to address climate change. In other words, because of their more intensely industrial economic trajectory, because they have emitted more carbon dioxide in the past, it is basically because of that today they have both the resources and also the scientific and technical know-how to address questions of climate change better than other countries. The fourth point or peculiarity about climate change is that it is precisely those countries which have emitted more in the past that also can exert a disproportionate amount of pressure and influence on the global climate change dialogue. Why is that? The basic reason behind this is a simple one. If one country has been a large emitter and continues to be a large emitter, then any kind of treaty or international protocol to rein in climate change as a problem must, if it is to be effective, involve that particularly large emitter. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a point to having that treaty or protocol. And the final point which must be remembered as far as the relationship between justice and climate change is concerned is that climate change is a peculiar kind of environmental problem. Climate change is not like pollution of different kinds. For instance, emission of sulfate aerosols or emission of CFCs, which disrupt or destroy the ozone layer. Climate change, or the emission of carbon dioxide, while it is pollution on the one hand, it is also a resource on the other. And it is precisely by using this resource that countries of the advanced West, countries like UK, the United States, Canada, France, etc., today have become developed countries. And developmental needs are also something which exist and exist very strongly for developing countries. So this resource, which is a finite resource, I'll tell you just now what I mean, but this resource also has to be shared equitably by different countries. Our best understanding of climate change, which was contained in the latest report of the IPCC, tells us that if we want to have a 67% probability of containing climate change to 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels, it basically means that in the future, from 2012, we can emit only 325 gigaton. A gigaton is a billion tons, only 325 gigaton of carbon. So the question obviously arises how this 325 gigaton of carbon will be divided between different nations. Please remember that developed countries accounting for a lion's share of historical emissions have already used up more than their fair share of this global atmospheric resource. So how much will the developing countries get of this resource is a very, very vital question. Therefore, in summary, the question of climate change is directly linked with the question of justice and democracy because of certain peculiarities and inequalities which have existed on the global scale. And these inequalities basically have to do with the fact that while climate change is a global problem affecting all countries, particularly the developing countries, it is only a handful of countries, the developed countries, which are responsible for a lion's share of the historical emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases till now.